Hello everyone, this is LG Demonstration 4.1. It is a companion video that I promised to LG Demonstration number 4. Um, Weirdly though, as I was kind of making it, I decided that actually working, the subject matter of this video remains consistent to what I wanted it to be, but it turned out I think that a different game was a better demonstration of, or offered, excuse me, a better demonstration of what the subject matter was going to actually be. So, hence, things are a little bit different. Instead of PT31, which is the subject of LG number 4, LG demo number 4, we'll be working out of PT54 section 3, specifically question 23, the very last one today. So why did I make this? Well, the goal is, again, this is the first of two supplementary videos that I promised during LG demonstration number 4, and this one is actually going to cover how to actually diagram stuff, specifically how to move between mandatory and non-mandatory things when filling out diagrams. Um, Note that I have been demonstrating my overall procedure, including the stuff that I do here, throughout all of my LG work. However, this video specifically will try to make some of my decision-making process a touch more explicit. So what is the process that I'm specifically trying to demonstrate here? Well, it's really a division between stage 1 and stage 2, what I call mandatory consequences in stage 1, and filling in non-mandatory consequences for stage 2. Which is closely related to the giving ourselves room to succeed thing, where if we are filling in things that are optional, that we don't have to, but we're just trying to finish out a picture, then we are going to opt to give ourselves the most freedom so that we have the most flexibility to fulfill all the rules as we go along. That's not going to be much of an issue here, but it's really it's about today's video is about the division between mandatory consequences and non-mandatory consequences of the rules. So here's a disclaimer though, early on. Some of you, in the middle of when you get to the stage 1 and stage 2 stuff later in this presentation, will likely notice that the line between these stages is actually quite blurry in practice. So suffice it to say for now that you would be correct to see it that way. I will address the issue more fully in the ending takeaway section. And also, again, I just want to remind you, in case you didn't catch it on the title screen, LG demonstration number 4, which kind of inspired this video, was doing the game section from PT31. But this particular video is actually going to work out of PT54, section 3. Alright, so let's actually just set up the particular game that I'm talking about from PT54. As always, we start with the intro paragraph. And here we have a situation where there's a panel reviewing 6 bids, H, J, K, R, S, and T. Those are the 6 bids that are being entered. And we appear to be ordering them from lowest cost to highest cost. And I'm just going to work from left to right, and I'm going to have the lowest cost be represented at the left, and then moving across the diagram, the highest cost will be at the extreme right. So in addition to putting these bids in order of cost from lowest to highest, it also appears we are selecting a winner amongst these bids. And that's from the intro paragraph, not from the first rule. There's exactly one winner within the intro paragraph. So this game is actually a mild hybrid. I would say that there's a matching element, because we're matching a property called winning bid to whoever the winner actually is. Arguably, you could make this an in and out situation, but I do believe that matching just makes more sense here, because really when it comes to it, in and out games are really characterized by the possibility of more than one thing being in, although that's not always how it works out. But to me, there is no in and out mechanism. It's really about, we put them in order, we're not really disqualifying any of them, we're just simply matching the winning condition to one of them. Again, these labels, these names, really not the most important thing. It's just so that we're all on the same page vocabulary-wise is the only reason I'm doing this. Alright, so now that we've gathered all that information from the intro paragraph, time to slap together a diagram. It's going to be pretty simple. My baseline diagram is just going to be the list of bids, H, J, K, R, S, and T, followed by our typical ordering diagram, which is just 6 blank slots, 1 for each of the bids. And in terms of the winner, to the extent that we may or may not need to actually make a notation of the winner, I can just write W or mark an X underneath the blank, whereas I would be writing the bids on top of the blank. But we don't even know that we'll be needing to really do this, because there being only one winner may not actually be that important, mechanically speaking. Now that we've done that, let us move into the rules. So I didn't translate them visually here for the sake of just getting this out faster, because having like the different rules kind of better represented visually, requires a lot of editing and animation on my part, and I just didn't want to take the time to do that. I thought it was more important to get this out faster than it was to get it out prettier. But I at least maintained a consistent left to right orientation to reflect the lower cost, higher cost relationships that the rules talk about. So starting with rule number one. Rule number one tells us basically the winning bid is going to be either K or R. And also the winning bid, in addition to being one of these two, is going to have to appear in slot 2 or 3. So interestingly, the cheapest bid isn't the one that wins by default, which is just something that, which actually reflects reality to some degree. Just because you insert as a contractor or subcontractor the lowest bid out there doesn't mean that you're going to win it automatically. And that seems to be what's going on here. But yeah, rule 2. It tells us that H must be lower in cost than J and K, and so what that translates into visually is that H is going to appear to the left of J, both J and K. We don't know the relative position of J and K based on this rule alone, but we just know that H has to appear to the left of both of those letters. Rule 3 is a little bit interesting. It's got some formal logic, but let's talk about it a little bit. This tells us that if J occupies the 4th slot, then the outcome of that is J has to be to the left of S and T. You could contrapose this, but I'm not sure that that's going to be that helpful. The contrapositive would be that if J is not to the left of both S and T, then J is not 4th. But there's so many ways to fulfill that condition of J is not to the left of both S and T. Does that mean that J is not to the left of S, J is not to the left of T, or J is not to the left of both of them? So yeah, that's 3 distinct possibilities, and visually I don't think we would get much out of contraposing this one. Rule number 4 is very convenient because it is not the contrapositive, but it is sort of the opposite. It gives us anytime J is not in 4th, we see that S and T are in turn to the left of J, because that's what it means for J to be more expensive, higher in cost than both S and T. Now that would mean that J is to the right of both S and T, but just to keep it consistent, I'm just going to say S and T are to the left of J. So yeah, there's an interesting note about the interaction of those two rules that I'll talk about on the next slide. Just pushing on to Rule 5 for the time being. Rule 5 is very simple. It tells us that spot number 5 is always going to be occupied by one of R or S. It can only be occupied by one of these two, because either R or S is the one that goes in slot 5, according to the rule. Alright, so that brings us to the oft-skipped deduction stage, and yeah, I have no deductions. A big note from me. The only thing I'm going to do is note some important interactions here. Note that these are not really deductions, they're just taking note of how the rules may play into each other. We're not really setting anything in stone in terms of, I figured this out ahead of time. Rule 3 and Rule 4, the ones about J, those are kind of interesting because really, if you think about it, Rule 3 governs everything that happens when J is in slot 4. But Rule 4 adds that it governs everything that happens when J is not in slot 4. So between those two rules, it covers everything about J. No matter where we place J, we kind of know what the outcome of that is going to be. So yeah, that's what brings me to say here that J's position seems like it matters a lot, since placing J somewhere eats up half, which is 3 out of the total 6 slots, because putting J anywhere, 1, 2, 3, 5, 6, any one of those spots, means that S and T have to be the left of J, so that's kind of half of the board accounted for in some way, shape, or form. And the alternative is if you put it in slot 4 itself specifically, then we know that S and T are to the right of J, and so that also eats up half the board. So no matter what we do with J, we kind of know what's going on, and that's an important thing, I think. Rule 2 would be the other thing that I would be on the lookout for. H being to the left of J and K means that we have the relative positions of a different set of 3 out of the total 6 entities. So instead of J, S, and T, now we have H, J, and K in a similar kind of relationship, although it's simpler than the J, S, and T relationship. While this is really currently too uncertain because we could just imaginarily just put H first and then J and K basically have free reign of the board. So it's too uncertain to yield a lot of set outcomes that would be deduction level stuff. But we can at least know that dropping J or K somewhere is going to have consequences for H. That's what we should keep in mind. And finally, Rule 5 is the only other one that I think yields any sort of, we've talked about 4 out of the 5 rules, so that's just basically all of them. This came close to giving us something immediately useful, but then right away they diluted it by making either R or S the one that goes in slot 5. So they came really close to giving us certainty on this one, but then they took it away from us. However, this is still handy, because we know that anytime we place one of R or S somewhere else, we should immediately be thinking about who goes into 5. So, and maybe it's not even 5, but yeah, anytime you place R or S anywhere, you should be thinking about where the other one goes, especially in relation to Rule 5. So, Rule 5, although it looks like they kind of tried to give you something and then snapped it back, rug pulled it at the last moment, they actually are giving you something useful here. They give us a very tight relationship between R and S as regards slot 5 in our diagram. So let's actually get into the one question that I think properly demonstrates this whole stage 1, stage 2 business about when you fill in diagrams. Half the time I seem to be talking about mandatory outcomes based on the rules, and the other half the time I seem to be talking about, well, it could work, so I'm just going to do it. If this could work, so I'm just going to do here, and just so on and so forth. And yeah, that can understandably be a little bit confusing because my process is kind of fluid when it moves back and forth. So today, here's an attempt to kind of make that a little bit more concrete, starting with this question. So question 23 is an if question. It is not an open-ended question. It tells us if R is the lowest in cost, what must be false on the basis of that? So the procedure for this, ideally, this is very similar from basically any other game, especially the one that I did in Logic Games demonstration before. Ideally, for a question like this one, especially since it's so late in the section, a game will have generated enough completed boards/diagrams at this point for us to make several easy eliminations. But I don't think the work from the previous questions on this particular game yielded anything that usable for us. I could be misremembering because I did do this just this past week with a student, a tutoring student of mine. But I don't recall at the present moment, whether or not there was anything from the previous, few questions that helped knock anything out. But I don't recall that it did. And either way, even if it did, because we're not doing it together here, I am going to proceed as if we're doing it with nothing previous available. So it's going to be done cold and fresh. So I'm going to start right up with stage 1. I'm going to plug R into that first/lowest price slot, and then follow whatever chain of mandatory consequences cascade out of that. After I've exhausted that, I will move into stage 2. I will be prepared to fill out the rest of the diagram based on non-mandatory things, or at least things that seemed non-mandatory at first pass. There's a decent chance that stage 1 will leave us short of picking the correct answer. There's also, on the flip side, a not terrible chance that just the mandatory consequences alone are enough. So I wouldn't fault you guys for just doing stage 1 work and then moving directly into answer choices just to see if that's enough. In fact, that's what I'd recommend at several points in previous LG videos. But again, for the purposes of just demonstrating that you can draw a line between mandatory and optional outcomes in a game, I'm just going to kind of proceed as if we're going to assume that stage 1 is not going to be enough, because there's a good chance in practice that it won't. So starting with our stage 1 work here, we are going to plug in the information from the question stem and then work from there. And so plugging in the information from the question stem looks just like this. Question 23 tells us that if R is in the first/lowest cost slot, what could be false on the basis of that? So to answer that question, we first, in stage 1, look for mandatory consequences. And my eye is immediately drawn to Rule 5, because Rule 5 is the one that tells us that slot 5 on this diagram has to be occupied by either R or S. Those are the only two that are allowed to go into 5. So yeah, one of those two always has to be in 5, but since the question places R all the way over in slot 1, that means that we must put S in slot 5. And this is what we end up with. Because again, one of the two, R or S, have to be in slot 5. Since we know that R can't be the one to fulfill that duty, we now know that it falls exclusively upon S. S is the only one that can fulfill the demands of Rule 5 now. So this is what our diagram is upgraded to. And unfortunately, I think that is it when it comes to mandatory consequences just on the face of the rules without doing any further diagramming or interacting. And this is what I mean by that. If we loop back and look at rule number 1, I mean, we do know that K does have to occupy 2 or 3 and be declared the winner, but at least on the surface and with no further work and without combining it with any other rules or possibilities, I don't feel like we know, just on the basis of rule 1 alone and this diagram, where K precisely lands. I still look 2 and 3 are both open, and so I don't really know which one to put it in, so I don't consider that as mandatory of a consequence as rule number 5 is. Similarly, rule number 2, again, I'm looking at rule number 2 independently without combining it with anything else. And rule number 2 on its face, applied to the diagram that we have, we do seem to still have a lot of freedom to place that HJK block. We still have 4 open spaces, and H and J and K, we don't know if they're touching or not touching, so we seem to be able to kind of slinky it around somewhere in here. We can fit those 3 into the gaps that we have. Again, not combining Rule 2 with anything else, just seeing if we can fit Rule 2 into the picture that we have. Yeah, it seems possible. Rules 3 and 4 are similar. It looks like we could put J into slot 4, and then all that would force us to do is put T into slot 6 when that happens. And that would respect, Rule 3's J is to the left of S and T, that whole block. However, the diagram as written with just the R and the S in it so far, it seems to also support the Rule 4 situation when J is not in 4th. Let's say we put J all the way in the back at 6th. We could still put T to the left of S somewhere, and that would also put it to the left of J, which in turn, in total, respects Rule 4's S and T are to the left of J when J is not 4th. That whole shebang. So, Rule 1 on its own, Rule 2 on its own, Rule 3 on its own, Rule 4 on its own, doesn't seem to be able to draw a mandatory consequence to the extent that Rule 5 draws a mandatory consequence. Rule 5, the combination of Rule 5 with the information from the question stem is incontrovertible. It just for sure leads us to S being in slot 5. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. There's no flexibility there. That's it. And so that's why I would consider Rule 5 a mandatory consequence, and Rules 1 through 4 independently do not qualify as mandatory consequences. That being said, although we only did have one mandatory consequence, this whole diagram that we have, R, 3 blanks, S, and a blank, that does eliminate B, because we know from Rule 5 again, that the work that we just did here, we must place S into the 5th slot, so it cannot ever be false that S goes into 5. Push into stage 2. So again, I tried to avoid doing massive text dumps, but I just had to put a lot of stuff on the slide, so the font got really small. My apologies for that. But yeah, stage 2, we're just going to import the work that we did from stage 1, because stage 1 is a mandatory consequence, so this has to be the case. And we're going to start from here, and we're just going to try filling this in, because our stage 1 work alone was only enough to eliminate one answer, so we need to somehow deal with the rest of these somehow. And so before doing that, because we filled this in, it's not a completely open-ended question, we filled this in at least a little bit, it's worth pushing it forward and seeing if we can finish out a couple of hypothetical diagrams. So now we are going to fill the diagram in, because it's stage 2, with non-mandatory consequences. And I'm just going to start right at the top of the list, starting with rule number 1, which is something that we kind of touched upon in the last slide anyway. Rule 1 tells us that K or R has to be the one that wins, and whichever one of those 2 wins has to do so from space 2 or space 3. So again, one of those 2 always has to be in slot 2 or 3, and since the question places bid R into slot 1, bid K has to be the one to go into 2 or 3. So this is what happens. This is the first possibility. R goes first, K goes second, and S goes 5th. The other possibility is R goes first, K goes third, and S goes 5th. Those are the 2 places that Rule 1 allows K to go at this point. And of course, K would have to be the winner as well. So now I'm going to move on to Rule 2 and see if adding that to the mix yields any other insights for us. And it does. It appears that the first of the 2 possibilities that we have found just above doesn't work, because in that first possibility where R is first, K is second, and S is 5th, there's no way for us to place H to the left of K. There's no room to squeeze H in there. R and K are in the first 2 slots. There's no room for H. So that one is now invalid according to Rule 2. That means that the second possibility, the one below it, R is first, there's a blank in second, and then K is third, that one is the only one that works, and H is in fact forced to go into slot 2, into that one. So again, we got rid of the top one because that's invalid. There's no way to satisfy Rule 1 and Rule 2 with that diagram. However, the second one, we can throw H, in fact we have to throw H into slot 2, but that at least mercifully does help us satisfy Rule number 2. Alright, so now we have this RHK blank S blank situation. Moving now into Rules 3 and 4. Rules 3 and 4 could be intimidating, but just because we filled in so much of the diagram, we may quickly find out that we run into walls, and I think we will. So, as indicated during our Stage 1 pass on these rules, it does appear that J could go into 4th and T into 6th, respecting Rule 3, and our diagram so far that we've built still supports that. If we throw J into fourth, we can throw T into sixth because those two slots are open. But as also indicated during our stage 1 pass on these two particular rules, it appears that J could also go into slot 6, and then we could throw T into slot 4, which respects rule 4, because that tells us anytime J isn't fourth, S and T come before it, come to the left of it, and that would be what happens here. And so in case you're having trouble following along verbally, this is what it looks like visually. So the top line is what happens when we are focused on satisfying rule 4. That would mean that we have RHK, which came from our Rule 2 work. Then we threw J into the fourth slot, and because J is in the fourth slot, Rule 3 tells us that S and T have to appear in the higher cost slots, so to J's right, and that's precisely what happened. Similar thing, just with Rule 4, when it comes to the bottom line. So the very bottom line, you'll see we have RHK, which again came from our Rule 2 work. And then we threw J into the very back, into the most expensive slot, slot 6. And then we threw T into the fourth slot, and that seems to work out because now, according to Rule 4, if J is not fourth, S and T are both to the left of J, and that's been respected here. So this is what we have at this point again, right, from the last slide. We have these are the two possibilities based on R being first. We are very methodical with the rules, and this is what we came up with. It is not necessary, but a quick pass on all the rules for both of these possibilities would confirm that both of these diagrams are indeed valid. But since we've been quite methodical about it, I'm not going to explicitly recheck it here, but you can do that very quickly. It's really just a rehash of everything that we discussed in the previous two slides. So a question that I get occasionally via email is that I keep saying that we don't need to check it because we've been methodical, but have we really been methodical? And I would say yes we have. Notice I did nothing super secret or special. In stage 1, I did the one obvious thing, which was look at Rule 5. Because Rule 5 deals with the only two ways to fill slot 5 is to put R in there or to put S in there. And then the question itself took one of those, R, and put it somewhere else. That immediately tells me that the other option is now the only one, S. S is now the only one allowed to pick up the slack and fulfill the demands of Rule 5. So that was like the one obvious thing, and that's the one thing that I did in stage 1. And in stage 2, I just went right down the list of the remaining rules, because again, we already dealt with Rule 5, so I just started right back up with Rule 1 and just went down the list until things kind of clicked. That's all there is to this particular question. Admittedly, there might be some other games and other questions out there where it would behoove you to move in a different order. So instead of rules 1 through 4 in that order, 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe the smart thing to do is go Rule 3, Rule 4, and then loop back up to 1 and then come down to 2. So instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, it's 3, 4, 1, 2, something like that, whatever it is. But whatever the altered order is, if it's not in numerical order, if you need to go into some other order, that altered order should make itself apparent. It'll be exactly like Stage 1 and Rule 5. It just made sense for us to go right to Rule 5 because of the interactions between R, S, and slot 5 and Rule 5. That just all made sense, right? And so if there is a more optimum order of things to consider in, just keep following the chain of consequences, and that order that you should be working with it will just happen. It will just happen. And in fact, in a number of my videos, if you've been following along with my content, I am very likely doing precisely what I described in the above bullet point. Although I am, whenever I'm conscious of it, trying to just kind of start right at Rule 1 and go down the list. If I have a better idea, I'll skip right to the relevant rule and then work from there, rather than just, brain dead-ishly just starting right at Rule 1 and going down the list. I do have a tendency to do that, but I also don't do that as it's convenient. So yeah, that's all that I mean by the previous point. So continuing on with this, again, this is the work that we have, and we don't need to check it. We're doing answer choices now, and we're stacking up each answer choice against these pictures. And as I've kind of prematurely pressed the next item on the slide on my clicker here, so it was kind of a spoiler, but yes, A is actually the correct answer, so select it. This is a could-be-false question, and A could be false. It is in fact true that J does not have to be the highest in cost. So to say that J is highest in cost, that statement could be false because J could be fourth highest in cost, as we've seen. And so even though I would say it's not strictly necessary, we'll just do it for learning purposes. Eliminating B, we've already eliminated this one via stage 1 work. S is already out. We can eliminate C. In both of the possible outcomes, K is third, so yeah, we can eliminate this one. This one definitely could be false. We can eliminate D. In both of the possible outcomes, H is in fact second, so there's no way for this to be false. It has to be true. And we can also eliminate answer choice E. In stage 2, and arguably also in stage 1, literally the first thing we noticed is that because the question places R first, Rule 1 then mandates that K must be in 2 or 3 and it must be the winner. So E definitely is out for that reason. So that brings us to the closing section here. The takeaways from today. As I noted at the beginning, you all might have noticed that we arguably did most of the stage 2 work, which is understanding the non-mandatory consequences, while we were technically doing the stage 1 work, understanding mandatory consequences. This makes a lot of sense, right? Because after all, how can you really know that you're done with all the mandatory consequences unless you've looked at all the other rules, really applied those other rules to observe their effect, if they have any, on the diagram, and then confirm that these other rules do not, in fact, add any mandatory consequences on their own. Like, so we kind of have to check all the other rules anyway, and kind of do half of the non-mandatory work in the course of confirming that there, in fact, are no more mandatory consequences. Also, what you have noticed, by the time we got to stage 2, even though we thought we were done with mandatory consequences, actually we weren't, because combining independently non-mandatory outcomes you can sometimes discover through that there's a mandatory interaction between such outcomes. So the example of this would be rule number 2, positioning H to the left of J and K. Just on its own, and just compared to the initial diagram where we had R at the first slot and S at the fifth slot, that and rule 2, those two things alone didn't really set anything in stone. But when we figured out when we combined that with rule number 1 and where K could go, all of a sudden it seemed like we got a new mandatory outcome. K all of a sudden had to be third, and H all of a sudden had to be second. And that mandatoriness did not come about until we started trying to combine the rules together, right? So this again is different than Rule 5. Rule 5 didn't need anything else other than what the question stem told us in order to yield a set outcome, S is in fifth. So again, the question stem's information plus the Rule 5 alone. Rule 5 didn't need anything else other than that to just yield a one set outcome. All the other rules, they didn't on their own in combination with the question stem. So rule 2 plus the question stem information didn't yield a one set outcome. Rule 1, same thing, didn't do that. Neither did Rule 3 and neither did Rule 4. But when we start trying to put things together, once we accounted for Rule 1 in two different ways, and then tried to fit Rule 2 into the picture that already accounted for Rule number 1 at the same time, that started to yield more collisions and more mandatory outcomes. So really, the line is quite blurred, so that begs the question of what is the point of having an entire video distinguishing between mandatory and non-mandatory outcomes? And this is the reason, really. Over the past few years, I would say past 4-ish years, I've noticed that a number of my students who are otherwise talented at LG sometimes struggle to grapple with that blurry line between mandatory consequences and non-mandatory consequences. And we're getting a bit lost when I fluidly transition from stage 1 into stage 2 and back again. Because that's kind of what happened, right? I started stage 1, and that only yielded one strictly mandatory thing, which was Rule 5. And then I just checked rules 1 through 4 just to make sure I wasn't missing anything. And I began to see some interactions, but I didn't really make a note of them. But I just kind of saw how they worked with R and S. But again, I explicitly did not combine them together because combining them together is something that I reserve for stage 2. And that's precisely what I did in stage 2. I inserted the information from Rule 1, which yielded 2 possible outcomes, either K is second or K is third. And then when I added Rule 3 to that consideration, that immediately exposed the first one of those 2 possibilities, the one where K goes second, as invalid because we cannot do that and also satisfy Rule number 2. And so yeah, arguably what happened in stage 2 is that we got mandatory consequences out of combining non-mandatory outcomes. So, there's a lot of back and forth between what must be true and what could be true when filling in a diagram. And I've noticed that over the past few years, and this is probably a much more deeper-seated problem with the way I teach things, I noticed that people were starting to ask questions about, hey, I thought we were still doing mandatory stuff. Why are we talking about things that could be true? And then once even after I told people we're done with mandatory consequences, all of a sudden I'm still talking about mandatory consequences, even though I just literally said a few minutes ago that we were done with them. Admittedly, I could see how people got confused. The hope is that even though in practice it should remain a fluid and rapid process for you, pretty much exactly like I showed you, you kind of take things as they come to you and do them fluidly, and maybe independently they're non-mandatory, but when you push them together and try to make things interact, all of a sudden things do become mandatory. That fluidity, um, hopefully by having this discussion here and showing you that this is kind of the breakdown of what I see, but this is also at the same time why the breakdown kind of blurs itself. By discussing this issue, the hope is that you will be able to have a firmer grasp on how to handle that fluidity between mandatory and non-mandatory diagram work. And of course, that does bring us now to officially the end of the end. So, as always, I do all the algorithm stuff that helps the channel. I'm doing this to help myself and to help you guys. So, the more people who know about this, or the more people who can get free help, and of course, you guys can use all the free help you can get because you're getting charged left and right for various things. Just to take the exam and prepare for it is already a significant outlay. So yeah, feel free to leave a comment if you want to, but the fastest way to get my attention really is to email me at the email specified here. But yeah, let me know, especially I'm curious on this one, if this helped you at all, if you were struggling to kind of figure out, okay, I'm filling in things, but I'm, how the whole must be true, could be true thing as you're filling things in. If you were one of the many people who seem to be a little bit lost by that, let me know if this helped you. And if it didn't, especially let me know if that's the case, so that we can talk about where things could have been clear, and I can and I'll be more than happy to give you a free consultation to make up for the shortcomings of this particular offering. So yeah, be on the lookout for the second companion video that I promised for during Logic Games demonstration number 4. I'm hoping to get that one out either tomorrow or the day after. Alright, I will see you guys in the next one.